Okay, this is the second video on logical fallacies. What we're going to talk about in this video are fallacies which aren't really using logic incorrectly, but they're ways that people try to avoid using logic entirely. So things that people do that they try and make it sound like it's logical, but it actually has no kind of logical connection at all. Okay, and so I've got a list of, I think there's like 9 of these that we're going to go over. And so I'll kind of explain what they are and then give you an example of how people use them. So the first one here is what's called an ad hominem attack. So ad hominem is Latin for to the man. And what it means is that you, rather than kind of logically explaining your point and why what you think is true, instead you attack the other person. And insult them or say that they're not qualified to talk about it or something like that, right? So an example of this might be if you have a company which is polluting a stream somewhere and a local resident says, this gasoline that's being pumped into our streams is hurting our children. And the oil company might respond and say, well, that person only has a high school education, so they don't know what they're talking about. Right? That's an ad hominem attack. They haven't explained why the gasoline isn't hurting the children or debated the point. They've just attacked the person and tried to discredit them. So that's kind of your classic ad hominem argument. It's not logical. It's just trying to avoid having to have a logical discussion. The second one here is kind of the opposite of that. So this is an appeal to authority. And so what appeal to authority means is basically saying that because somebody has some sort of credential, that they must be right. So like you'll see this a lot in commercials. They'll say something like, 3 out of 4 dentists recommend this product, right? And so that's an appeal to authority. It's not actually telling you whether the product works or not, or trying to convince you that the product worked even. It's just saying these are authorities who say that it works. Another example, parents use this all the time. A kid will be like, why do I have to clean my room? And their parents be, because I said so. Right? That's an appeal to authority. Right? You're not explaining you have to clean your room because otherwise, there's food under your bed and we're going to get mice and blah, 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 blah. You could explain why, but instead they just appeal to authority rather than logically arguing it. Okay? Next one is kind of the opposite of that. This is an appeal to ignorance. So an appeal to ignorance says because we don't know whether something is true, it could be true or it is true, right? Classically, an appeal to ignorance would say we can't prove that this didn't happen, so it did happen. Conspiracy theories, a lot of times, are appeals to ignorance. So, somebody will say like, you can't prove that aliens didn't build the pyramids, so aliens built the pyramids, right? And they're not actually logically convincing you of why they think that aliens built the pyramids. They're just saying, because you can't prove that it's not, it must be true, right? And so the same idea on the internet, a lot of times an appeal to ignorance comes as, like you'll say something and then somebody be like, well, prove to me that that's true, right? That's kind of a challenge of saying I'm ignorant, and so you need to prove to me that this is actually true. Okay, so appeal to ignorance is saying we can't prove that it's not true, therefore it is true. Okay, that doesn't work, not logically. Next one here is appeal to consequence. This one's really popular with politicians. So an appeal to consequence is because I want this to be true, it has to be true. And it sounds silly to say it that way, but you hear people use this all the time, right? So one thing that you'll hear right now as far as an appeal to consequence, people are talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, and they'll say, if we don't reopen businesses, our economy will be destroyed, therefore we should reopen businesses. Right? That's an appeal to consequence. They're saying because the economy will be destroyed if we don't do it, we have to do this. And of course, there are lots of other considerations there. Whether we should reopen businesses or not is a much more complicated issue than that. And so making that appeal to consequence is part of the discussion, but it can't be all of the discussion. And so if you just say, this needs to be true in order to make something else true, that's an appeal to consequence. Our next one here is a false dilemma. So in a false dilemma, the person you're arguing with tries to convince you that there's only two possibilities and that you have to pick one of them. And so usually there's more than two options. And so they're trying to say the one that they want and then something else that's really, really bad. And so, okay, so this one's really, really bad. You have to take this one, right? Is kind of how the argument usually goes. So an example of a false dilemma is somebody saying, either we hire more police or crime rates will go up. And so they're saying, we don't want crime rates to go up, so we have to hire more police. But that's a false dilemma because there are other things that you could do. You could help the police that you have be more effective. Maybe you could get them more technology. You could do more community policing or whatever, other things to help the crime rate go down. So that's an example of a false dilemma. The next one here is circular reasoning. So circular reasoning says that if something is true, therefore it is true. And it's just as dumb as it sounds, but people use it still kind of a lot of times when they're very emotional, they'll use circular reasoning without realizing it. So an example of circular reasoning is, say, a parent finds out that their kid's been accused of having marijuana in school, and maybe they say, my child can't have been caught with marijuana at school. They're a good kid, right? Or they're not that kind of kid. Maybe we don't want to have a value judgment of whether having marijuana or not makes you good or bad, but they say my child couldn't have been caught having marijuana at school. They're not that kind of kid, right? Well, they were caught, so therefore they are the kind of kid who gets caught with marijuana at school. So you can't argue that they're not that kind because it's happened. So that's circular reasoning. So people use this, like I said, again, when they get emotional, they don't think about what they're saying. But when you start to pick it apart, it doesn't make any sense. The next one here is post hoc. It's actually short for post hoc ergo propter hoc in full Latin. But again, most people just call it a post hoc argument. And a post hoc argument is saying that because one thing happened before another, it caused it to happen. Okay? And so a lot of times, like, superstitions will be this. So somebody would be like, the day that I wore my blue socks, I met my future partner, and so therefore those socks are lucky and I should wear them, right? And so things that are totally unrelated, or seemingly unrelated, but because one happened before the other, people will say that one caused the other. And that's not, again, like I said, it's superstition, really. But people can use post hoc arguments in much more sophisticated ways. So somebody might say, like, I noticed that the stock market went up the day after the presidential primary, right? And so the next time there's a presidential primary, I'm going to expect the stock market to go up. And that may have an effect, right? There may be some sort of cause there. But again, you can't just necessarily assume unless there's some other reason why those two things should be connected. The next one here is a straw man. This is also popular on the internet. So in a straw man argument, you take what your opponent is arguing and you replace it with something much more exaggerated that's easier to argue against. So you'll see this, like I said, a lot on the internet. So an example kind of related to our current situation is saying something like a politician comes out and says, my opponent believes that we should wait for scientists to decide when the economy should reopen. Apparently they're fine with just waiting until all small businesses have failed and unemployment is 50%, right? And that's not what they said, right? They said we should wait until scientists think that it's okay. But they kind of blew that up and exaggerated because it's much easier to say if all small businesses have failed and unemployment is 50%, that would be really, really bad, right? And we hope that it doesn't get to that point. Hopefully you're not watching this video after that's happened, because it would be really bad. But the idea here is to replace your opponent's possibly reasonable argument with something that's really unreasonable because that's easier to argue against. The last one here, correlation implies causation. We've talked a little bit about this one already. We'll go just to go over it again. This is similar to post-hoc. In post-hoc, we said one thing happens and then another thing happens, and so we say that one causes the other. In correlation implies causation, what's happening is there's a relationship between something happening repeatedly and something else happening, and then people say, oh, one must have caused the other. And this is super easy to kind of make this mistake. People make this mistake all the time. It's a very easy logical mistake to make. Kind of an extreme example might be like if the example I use with Posthoc, if somebody said, after every single presidential primary, the stock market goes up. Therefore, presidential primaries cause the stock market to go up, right? Just because one happens and then the other doesn't mean that one is causing the other. Maybe they're both related to something else. Maybe after a presidential primary, based on who won, people have more economic confidence, and so then they go out and buy stocks or something like that. But it's multiple repeated events triggering something else. So now, usually when there's a correlation, there is some sort of causal relationship somewhere, but it may not be direct, right? It may be that one thing causes another thing to happen to cause another thing to happen. So there may be some sort of relationship, but it's not a direct causal relationship. Okay? So those are all the different fallacies. You should practice kind of thinking about what they all mean and how to distinguish between them and identify each of them.